All right, that looks like a good group. And so we'll get started with that. So hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our Advancing Indigenous Healthy Homes panel. My name is Kayla Fayant, the panel moderator for today. I am Métis from Fishing Lake Métis Settlement, and I work as the Energy Efficiency Projects Manager at Indigenous Clean Energy. So, Indigenous Clean Energy, if you don't know, is a not-for-profit organization that supports Indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations across Canada as they lead the clean energy transition. We do this across many amazing programs through capacity building, collective action, and collaboration. Specifically, our Bringing It Home program is working to address housing and health through energy efficient solutions. As I mentioned, collaboration is important to our work. That includes today, so I'd like to pass it over to Marie Schaller to introduce Canadian Climate Institute.
Marcy, Heichka, Kayla. Hello, everyone. My name is Maria. I'm the Director of Indigenous Research at Canadian Climate Institute. I'm really honored to be joining you from unceded Qualicum First Nation today. For those who aren't familiar with Canadian Climate Institute, we're a remote charitable organization located coast to coast to coast, and we have various research streams that work on climate policy, sustainable finance, clean growth, mitigation, adaptation, our 440 megatons team, and Indigenous research. And we have a very strong commitment to support and uplift Indigenous self-determination. And for the past 3 years, I've been working with Indigenous clean energy, and I am so thankful to Kayla, James, Mylin, Gary, and Will, who couldn't be here today, as well as many folks who I know are joining on this call for being a part of this work. As much as possible in our report, we wanted to amplify the hard work that people are doing in communities day to day. And one of those people I know is such a champion of housing is Kayla. We meet monthly to discuss healthy energy homes, and both of us come from a construction family background. I think all of the authors of the report have faced inadequate housing that is being exacerbated by climate change. And when I meet with Kayla, she's always in community and talking about the incredible programs that Indigenous Clean Energy runs. The past few weeks, she's been traveling quite a bit, and I'm very grateful for her time in moderating and all of you for taking the time to be here today. So, Heichka, please join me in uplifting Kayla for being the moderator here today and for the folks on this call for taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and everyone at Canadian Climate Institute, such a great partner through this project. So to get started, we have a couple housekeeping items. So first, this webinar will be delivered in English, but Zoom translation services should be available. We have put aside 10 minutes at the end for audience questions, so we'll ask that you use the Q&A box for that, but also throughout the whole panel, please feel free to utilize the chat function. Our team will be monitoring it. We'll be sharing links, more information, and resources. We only ask that the comments are respectful. So before I introduce you to our panel, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my home in Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. I'd also like to acknowledge the lands and additional caretakers of the lands that each of you are joining us from today. So if you care to do so, please feel free to use that chat to share where you're joining from. Our panelists today are Dr. Mylan Riva. You might have seen that Will Goodon and Gary Wilson were on our original lineup, but both couldn't make it today, so we are very grateful to have James Jenkins joining us on the panel. Dr. Mylene Riva is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at McGill University, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in Housing, Community, and Health, and the associate director of the McGill Energy Center. She leads an interdisciplinary and applied research program that focuses on housing, energy, and climate change. She expresses her gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka nations for their stewardship and care of the land and water of Tiohtià:ke, where she works and lives with her family. James Jenkins is the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy. James is a member of Walpole Island First Nation, where he has previously served as Chief Executive Officer. James led the development of First Nation equity participation in 200 megawatt wind farms. These and similar experiences led James to become a champion of Indigenous community and business partnerships in clean energy. James holds an MA from the University of Texas at Austin and is a former municipal clerk. He also has spent time running a consulting business. I hope I don't mispronounce it, AgeJack Solutions, which provided governance and management support for First Nations and businesses. James is a sessional instructor at Western University's Public Administration program and a proud father of three, a multi-instrumentalist, and an avid outdoorsman. So we invited each of these panelists here today to be part of a conversation around advancing this concept that we are calling healthy energy homes. This concept that housing should be centered around people and their well-being. Through energy efficiency, climate resilience, cultural values, and understanding the interconnections with health and housing. We introduced this concept in our scoping paper titled Beyond Sustainability in 2023, built on it with a virtual gathering in 2024. Then this past December, we put out a report titled Building Strength Through Shelter, Policy Descriptions for Indigenous Healthy Energy Homes. In the report, we made 6 policy recommendations for federal, provincial, and territorial governments. The recommendations include coordinated and integrated government action, co-developed policies and programs with Indigenous leadership, a commitment to long-term investment agreements, providing flexible funding options, measuring the holistic benefits and impacts of housing, and ensure funding programs are accessible and capacity responsive. I'm excited to continue to build on that work here today. So with that, let's get started. My first question is for Dr. Riva, and I believe Dean may be also sharing the questions in the chat if we get lost. For your first question, Dr. Riva, your work demonstrates how housing conditions are a core determinant of health, especially in northern contexts. Our report finds that when indoor environment of a home is improved, it can reduce pressures on the healthcare system. How should healthcare indicators be embedded into federal housing policy? And if so, which ones specifically? And then a second part to that question, how can Canada measure not just units built, but also improvement in people's well-being?
Right. Thank you very much, Kayla, for the question and the opportunity to be here. I'm really thankful and honored. So there's different angles that I could take to answer this question. I'll come back to where I see the power of healthy energy home is that it allows connecting housing and home to health and wellness in many different ways. A first pathway to health is for enabling indoor environments that are supportive of respiratory health. So we know that respiratory health is impacted by indoor air quality, humidity, exposure to mold, and to air pollutant, which can all be aggravated when homes are not energy efficient and can be compounded by extreme weather events. A second health element or wellness element that I would like to highlight is food security. So when living in homes that are expensive to heat or expensive to cool because, cooling needs are increasing. So this comes with a price, right? So paying for utilities, when we meet households and ask where they spend their money, paying for utilities is usually the second budget line after paying for rent and for mortgage. So then what is left is going to food, to transportation, to medications, to other essential needs. So some households, therefore, have to choose, or not choose, but have to balance between paying to heat versus paying to eat, right? So this is not a choice. It's, a balancing, an unfortunate balancing act. So improving energy efficiency of home has the potential to reduce energy consumption, reduce energy bills, therefore enabling families to fulfill other essential needs. Another element that I would like to highlight is the focus on home in healthy energy home. So home is, it's much more than housing. It is, of course, shelter, but it's all the symbolic dimension and elements that we attach to the place where we live. So home connects to identity, to culture, to family, to land, to spirituality. And so by centering home in housing policies, we start recognizing that we are talking about an ecosystem of connections. So to answer your question, should health indicators be included in housing policy? My response would be yes, certainly. But which one exactly? That is more difficult to answer. And there are several housing and well-being framework that have been developed by various nations across the country that could guide this work. But I would also argue that housing indicators should also be included in health policies because health and housing are closely connected, and housing and home are fundamental determinants of health and prerequisite for health. To answer your question or to not answer your question on how can Canada measure not just units, but also improvement in people's well-being, there's, different things that we can think of when answering this question. First is wellness and health are so much more difficult to measure than diseases, right? So we need to start thinking from a strength-based perspective and maybe shift away from always or only focusing on needs and deficits. So taking a holistic approach to housing and home. But maybe one way that we could start, paying attention to improvement in people's well-being in housing policies or in housing program is recognizing non-energy benefits, for example, in home energy upgrades program and policies, right? So these programs will heavily focus on or be assessed or evaluated for their potential to reduce greenhouse gas emission, to reduce energy consumption. But the improvements in thermal comfort is often not considered. And thermal comfort is an important factor that is conducive to health and to wellness. So I would argue that this might be one way to start including health and wellness indicators in housing policies or housing programs in the country is to focus on the non-energy benefits.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Mylan. That's something we say as well, that it's really hard to measure wellness, but it's a lot easier to measure illness. So my second question is for James. So drawing on your work at Indigenous Clean Energy, what are the main structural changes needed to move from consultation-based housing policy to true Indigenous jurisdictional authority over housing to ensure it is more climate resilient and energy efficient?
Well, thanks so much, Kayla, and thank you to everybody that's here. Thanks to CCI and your role in putting this together. So Kayla mentioned a bit of my background prior to coming to Indigenous Clean Energy, and I also have some experience with the housing program in my community at Walpole Island and a few other communities that I worked at with Agijac Solutions. And I think one immediate reality is the resourcing of Indigenous housing itself. And I spent a few years in the municipal sector. Before doing that, I had worked for my community for a number of years. And it was a well-known reality that all of our programming was under-resourced as a local government. Some prominent examples were teachers were paid almost half of what they were paid off the reserve. Child welfare officers paid less, almost half. And I went away for a few years, and there were some side-by-sides that occurred thanks to some adjudication efforts, lobbying efforts at the AFN level. And when I returned, there had been side-by-sides and an effort to bring education and social services funding to the same level as provincial programming. And that had a dramatically positive effect on those sectors. And I point that out because in spite of those side-by-sides, all of that positive change, I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, but it happened very quickly. We still have sectors like housing that we haven't gone through that kind of exercise. And that's to be said, housing departments and communities are punching well above their weight with the funding that they have to administer their programs. So that may be an exercise just to compare those programs to what exists in non-Indigenous communities. And what the impact is the resources that are needed to enforce building codes, properly inspect new builds, plan effectively to make sure that housing is meeting community needs, built in the right places. There is so little resourcing that often corners are cut, things are overlooked, and it's hard to quantify unless you're on the ground, seeing it happen in real time and seeing how these housing departments really are working hard to do what they can with the resources. And community members pay the cost of deficiencies with new builds. Many of them reach the end of the life well before the amortization period. You see issues like mold, poor drainage, and so I think addressing that overall shortfall and thinking about the larger resourcing picture does have to happen because it's kind of striking to see what inspectors have to do in order to properly oversee their portfolio. I would say the second is there are a suite of solutions to contribute to the building of new housing in communities, but they're not enough to address what's often a need on the social housing side. And in my experience, that need is so great, it can distort what happens on the market-based housing solutions. So there are a number of possible solutions that a community can pursue: ministerial guarantees, market-based housing, revolving funds, and I've seen all of them in practice. But usually the need for new social housing is so high that some of these programs are used to develop new social housing. Sometimes those that have the means to build a house or to purchase and renovate a house, and there are market-based solutions, but they have difficulty accessing them because of the social housing demand. And there's some more context here when I was talking to all of the work that goes into housing departments. There's also the reality of things like land title, the ability to capitalize on land. Things that we take for granted in non-Indigenous communities are often much more difficult, complex, especially on First Nation reserves or municipal-owned housing. So these market-based programs have come along to make it easier. However, the social demand is so high, even those with the means are having trouble getting into the market. And there are some really effective programs. CMHC has really opened up the ability for communities to finance social housing. But I find in most places it's still not enough, still falling well short of that. And what we find is there's still a major disconnect between all of the health outcomes that we're talking about now, the climate outcomes of housing that's built inefficiently. That's still very much disconnected from this programming. So, we'll talk about it a bit more, I'm sure, but tying those health outcomes and climate outcomes to housing, to building new houses and retrofits may open up more avenues for bringing private capital into the picture. Because right now, most communities, for different reasons, just find keeping up with demand is very difficult, and it's compounding the problem. And then another thing I'll mention, there are a number of subsidies at different periods. The federal government has provided some recently. These occur from utilities, provincial governments. More recently, with the need to keep up with rapidly climbing electricity demand, we are hearing announcements of new programs. But there is an opportunity to coordinate these much better and really create more of a carrot to harness the housing sector to respond to these kinds of subsidies, especially among Indigenous communities. Um, I was a bit surprised to learn the kind of programs that were available in the United States recently under the IRA, with subsidy amounts as high as $15,000 per unit in a program, and the ability to stack those. So just learning that was possible, and the kind of private capital that brought into social housing for some of these communities. I think we need to look outward and look at what is possible and think outside the box in terms of can we really stir up some investment in the efficiency side. Um, and then I think finally, what's really needed is greater Indigenous involvement in setting the energy policy itself and having Indigenous players and community representatives at the table when it comes to developing energy policies and energy planning. And one of the things that we hear about the most often is how different electricity rate subsidies, they can provide rate relief, but they can distort behavior and effectiveness of some of these efficiency programs. And we see that play out in different ways in the north, where the cost of diesel is very, very expensive and often requires some level of subsidization, but that can slow the integration of new cleaner technology and take away the momentum of housing retrofits and new sustainable housing. I experienced that in my own work at Walpole Island First Nation and other communities. Certainly, the experience of having to choose between nutritious food and paying the electricity bill was a reality in communities I've worked for, and the political leadership in Ontario, in the best interest of the communities it represents, really pushed for greater subsidization of electricity rates, and they were successful with the rural utility Hydro One. And I can recall this was 5 or 6 years ago. It really took the wind out of the sails of some of the efficiency programs because it brought down the cost of electricity for housing. And this was all done with the best of intentions, but I think we need to think about how do we get the Indigenous communities at the table where they're really contributing in a meaningful way to setting energy policies, so that we start to see policies that can lead to greater energy efficiency, greater health outcomes in the long run, without distorting this kind of behavior as we've seen. So I think there's a real opportunity there as we open up ways for Indigenous communities to have a seat at the table.
Great, thank you, James. Exactly what we've been saying, that the approaches need to be coordinated and co-developed with Indigenous leadership. So again, thank you. For the next question, it's for the both of you. Our research demonstrates that climate impacts like wildfire smoke, flooding, and extreme heat are intensifying the health risks of poor quality housing. How should housing strategies evolve to act as a frontline for climate adaptation infrastructure, particularly for Indigenous communities already facing disproportionate risk?
Would you like me to start that one, Mylene?
Yes.
Uh, so I haven't necessarily been around for more than a couple decades in this area, but I have been hearing that there have been calls for updating building codes for Indigenous communities for a very long time. And I dealt personally with the National Building Code, which isn't appropriate for many Indigenous housing subdivisions and other areas that deal with factors like high water tables, wildfire risk, unique environments, as well as material and transportation costs in the north. So the building code itself is often pointed to as a factor that could be improved. Now, that being said, there's been a great deal of work on updating the building code, and we talk a little bit about the consultant-driven industry. There's no shortage of work that's been done on that, and yet we're still left with challenges. But I think it is a good starting point to talk about what are the key challenges, what can be improved on a policy level. Um, but as I mentioned before, even a perfect building code that's highly adaptable to unique Indigenous communities will require greater resourcing for housing departments, inspectors, and the entire implementation and enforcement personnel that are ultimately going to have to administer the building code. So it's two key gaps that are in tandem with each other, and I think facing those issues head on is the way to start, but they are hidden in the background. I think they're real valid policy items that are contributing to poor health outcomes and less efficient houses.
Thanks, James. If I could add to that. So I'm involved in a pan-Canadian partnership called At Home in the North. So we're working with Northern partners to rethink the housing continuum to push forward with Northern partners this idea of a Northern housing ecosystem. And so recognizing housing as part of an ecosystem, there's definite adjustments to building codes that are needed, but then there's also recognition that housing is connected to so many essential infrastructures that are themselves impacted by climate change. So we can think of water infrastructure, energy infrastructure that James mentioned, the roads, whether they're on land, on water, on ice, in the air. So extreme weather event not only compromises the housing infrastructure itself and housing that is built from Southern standard that are not adapted to climate, to culture. So extreme weather event compromises houses as a structure, but they also compromises the whole infrastructure that supports housing, including supply chain, right? So wildfires, for example, will destroy warehouses where construction's material are being stored. And that happened in 2023 during the wildfires in the Northwest Territories. During heat waves, during warm summer months, the water level in rivers can compromise the delivery of construction material, again, can compromise hydropower generation and can have an impact on, the infrastructure needed for people to be able to live in their home, in their community, on their land. So I would argue, and that's the argument that we make in At Home in the North, is that housing, climate, health, and infrastructure, everything is related, and we need to look at it as a whole and not separately.
Yeah, and I'll probably add there are some communities with the means that have gone as far as develop their own policies, their own building codes. So there are opportunities for that. Sometimes regional organizations or PTOs have gone ahead and done that on the behalf of their membership. Um, I think as a whole, though, when you look nationwide, it's an opportunity to build more opportunity for Indigenous jurisdiction over that area and to be able to be adaptable to change as risk changes due to climate change, but also their unique regional needs.
Great, thank you both. I just saw too a comment in the chat that remembering that NBC is only the minimum requirements, and we are seeing communities implement their own standards, and I think that's an important step forward. So again, thank you both. My next question, with major investments like Build Canada Homes initiative, there's pressure to build quickly. Our report sheds light on how fragmented funding, policies, and accountability, along with short-term solutions, undermine long-term resilience. How do we ensure that scaling up housing supply does not lock in future climate and health vulnerabilities?
James, would you like to start? Would you like me to start
Sure,
with
I
that?
can start. Sure.
Okay.
So again, thinking back the last few decades, thinking back to housing built as far back as the 1980s and 1970s, there have been ebbs and flows in the amount of funding available from the federal government for Indigenous housing. And you can see that when you walk through a community. You can say, well, this was this year when there was a larger funding envelope. There's a subdivision over here. It's linked to this program. Um, and I think, when we look at the long term, we should we should keep that in mind with current programs, because the reality is almost all of those waves, and I don't mean to sound overly cynical because there's been some great work, but some of the problems we find in Indigenous communities, like housing, that is not very efficient, that runs into problems with the superstructure, starts to bring in much more moisture than it should, and starts to fail very early. Often that results from these periods of really building homes at a rapid rate in a short period of time, and then there's a bit of a feast or famine reality when it comes to these federal funding envelopes. So I think with that in mind, as we look at ways to link climate, look at ways to link health to these housing programs, we should try our best to bring that to the forefront. And I would say it really hasn't been in the past, because I've been around where there's a great deal of excitement when that happens, when there's the ability to see a large investment in Indigenous housing across the country. And efficiency, sustainability, those kinds of priorities are often lost. And we can just see that in the building, and it starts to put pressure on the supply chain as well, when demand for materials increases. So I think we need to be very mindful of that, especially when we're looking at a larger initiative where part of the effort is to really impact the non-Indigenous housing stock as well. What will that mean for the value chain, and for communities that may have more logistical challenges to bringing in materials and builders and everything else. So that's some of the questions I would ask. I think I've been I've come to see some major federal initiatives and said, now here's a real opportunity to start to integrate some of the sustainability goals, some of the efficiency goals into these housing programs. And so again, this is an opportunity to do that, because we're often, when it's not done, and we're looking at homes 10 years down the road that are facing need for major expensive repairs. If we had done it right from the start, it could have had that longer term impact. And we see that in Indigenous communities more than anywhere. There's always this pressure to build new houses, even though there's usually a long list of homes in need of repairs.
Yeah, all to that. Yeah, I just want to reiterate some points that James made. So there's some unfortunate parallels that we can see in Build Canada Homes and the narratives around the building boom that followed the Second World War, which historically contributed to many of the chronic housing, health, and economic challenges that are facing many Indigenous communities today. So, we can argue whether it's a housing crisis. It's a chronic issue of unmet housing needs that started a long time ago, right? So, I think we should, we as a government and being part of Canada, we should be cautious in implementing a crisis response solution to an issue that is chronic. I think that the question, and what we argue in A Home in the North, is not the question, is how many houses can we deliver? Can we build quickly? Houses are needed. We need to build more. But we should be asking, how can sustainable housing future be built by Indigenous people for Indigenous people? And structural change in housing delivery is required, and that through our work, we support that it starts by centering Indigenous housing governance. And with the risk, the risk of being engaged in a crisis response in building houses and more houses and as many houses as possible, is that it might create pressure, or it might enable communities that have the capacity to act quickly. It might favor some communities versus other, increasing inequalities and maybe rushing some decisions that will ultimately compromise sustainability of housing, as James was illustrated. And it also, run the risk of undermining local leadership and governance in housing. So, there is scope for housing policy in Canada to support sustainability. But to me and my work, and to the work that we've been doing, we see this as only being possible with Indigenous leadership, expertise, and governance. And this has to be recognized and enabled to a much greater extent.
Great answers. Thank you both. So for my next question, a key finding in our research is that housing, health, and climate policy are too often treated separately. What governance or funding mechanisms are needed to integrate these sectors into a single coordinated policy approach?
Do you want to start this time, Miley?
Sure. So what governance and funding mechanisms, from, again, going back to this idea of looking at housing as an ecosystem, I would say this is fundamental, that, by recognizing the interconnection between housing, community development, health, cultural vitality, looking at the ecosystem within which housing and home are situated, then this could help start bringing or breaking silos across envelopes. How to do this, though, James, I don't know if you have some answers to that, or some concrete experience that you could speak to, but I think, like, breaking the silo start by really recognizing the interconnection, and by investing in housing, and that's the argument that you make into the Healthy Energy Home Report. By investing in housing, we have the potential to save on healthcare, for example. And the housing crisis and the climate crisis crisis, or whatever we want to call it, like, they're interconnected, right? So and these are complex problem. We have to, find ways to account for these interconnection and complexities.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I agree. I've grown to think that the key challenge, it has to do with the spheres of jurisdiction between the provinces and the federal government, which is a unique Canadian feature that seems to play itself out in a pretty substantial way. And that's Indigenous housing is almost always a federal responsibility, and health is almost always a provincial responsibility. And there are federal health departments, there are health services within Indigenous communities. However, the impact of health outcomes is, in most cases, borne by the province. And the disconnect between the two is, I think, more extreme than we acknowledge. And that came into sharper focus for me during the COVID-19 pandemic, where in various roles, I was working with community health teams that do have a pandemic responsibility, and had to work in tandem with provincial health teams that shared those responses, and for case tracking had to work collaboratively. And I think it was a wake up call just in terms of, I don't know if there had been an event like that where there had to be that kind of collaboration for a very long time. Like, of course, there'd been H1N1, but that was very brief in comparison. So it really shone a light on what the obstacles were for that kind of collaboration and what the misunderstandings were. And it wasn't unusual for me to encounter a situation where a provincial agency, and that could be a health unit at a more local level, usually they weren't even aware that the federal government doesn't do primary care. And there were all of these assumptions in place, and it would take some really deliberate policy direction from the top and buy-in at all levels for the kind of collaboration to happen where we could start to see, here's how we can quantify the impact of improved housing and the impact on healthcare systems. Because there is an impact, it is direct, but thanks to these spheres of jurisdiction, the governments don't see it that way. And so I think, we should push for that kind of collaboration. It is important. It is starting to happen in different areas, and we've seen a large shift in the last 10 years where provincial health agencies really do consider it part of their responsibility to be responsive to the needs of Indigenous communities. So there is certainly a silver lining there. I think the opportunity is much greater now for that kind of collaboration than it has been in the past. Um, so that's a potential challenge when we know the health outcomes are real. We're talking about the government's pocketbook, but we need to see more collaboration to make that a reality. Now, the federal role when it comes to climate, there could be a more direct relationship there. The federal government could look at linking housing to climate targets as a way to harness private capital. And that's something that we're pushing for greater research into in our organization. Um, so I think, it should be all three. And there will need to be that kind of leadership to say, let's tackle these health outcomes. Let's acknowledge there are going to be things that the provincial healthcare systems still don't know about Indigenous communities, and there's going to have to be the space and the time invested to overcome those gaps.
For sure. I see you nodding, so I just want to check before we move on if you have anything to add to that, Dr. Mylan. You're good. Great. So we do have some audience questions. So we'll dive into a couple of those as long as we have time. So the first one's to either of you. Are you aware of any specific studies or pilots who have been able to quantify the health outcomes or non-energy benefits associated with healthy home retrofits? And are there specific organizations or academia working on quantifying these benefits?
We tried to do it. Sorry, James, did you wanted to say?
Oh, no, I was just
No?
wondering, please go ahead, but would you be able to put that in the chat, or is it there already?
I can put it in the chat. Oh, Dean beat me to it.
Where?
Oh,
Okay.
thank you.
So there are different groups across the world working on this, and that have been working on this for decades. Canada, we're just well behind the curve on home energy upgrades and energy efficiency, and paying attention to energy poverty, which is or energy precarity, which is one, something that we're paying attention to. So So we're working on a report that assesses research that have looked at home energy upgrades, including deep energy retrofits and impacts on health, and we can share it through Kayla and Maria at Canadian Climate Institute and Indigenous Clean Energy to distribute through the network when it's ready. But we're also doing some research with the municipality of Bridgewater in Nova Scotia and with Enviro Center in Ottawa, assessing energy retrofits of either social housing and home. Difficult to do. We are also dealing with small sample sizes. One of the things that we are noticing, and these are not Indigenous communities, so a neighborhood in downtown Ottawa, a community in the South Shore region of Nova Scotia, what we're seeing through qualitative interviews, the numbers are not large enough to do quantitative assessments. But through qualitative interviews, what we see is for some households, energy consumption was not necessarily reduced, nor energy bill reduced after the home retrofit. And that often happens when heat pumps are installed. Heat pumps can be inefficient when it's really cold outside, so a dual source of heating is needed. But then heat pump provides much needed cooling in the summer, a need that maybe wasn't met before. So interestingly, what we see when we speak to people that have gone through home energy upgrades, and these are usually lower income households, is that for those who have to spend a little bit more for utility, they don't mind as much because now they are comfortable inside their home. And so that's what I meant earlier when I talked about thermal comfort, an improvement in thermal comfort made possible by home energy upgrades. So if, we're only assessing reduction in greenhouse gas emission or reduction in energy consumption, we might be missing a real important story around improved well-being inside the home.
So thanks for that, Mylene. And there are, I will say there isn't a dearth of health studies in Indigenous communities. It's a fairly researched area. So I think that there's but one thing I just want to mention is, in addition to that, I think there was a comment that there are local health agencies within Indigenous communities, First Nations in Nunavut. For First Nations, one of the health mandates is to inspect homes for environmental issues and to report from a health perspective. And I'll just tell you, as a band manager, it was something that regularly landed on my desk, especially from the homes with the most problems, and those reports really did outline the health risks at a minimum of the situation. Now, really, because those programs are funded separately than capital programs that are usually administering housing, I think the general idea behind that process is that either a housing manager or somebody else can use those environmental health reports to advocate for capital. Again, thinking of this in the lens, and I think communities that do have the resources to develop their own processes and their own self-governance, they've taken this to another level. But for those that are strained with capacity, it can be very frustrating with the amount of funding that's available for research, for inspections and assessments, usually not linked for funding that can address the problem. And that's just a reality.
And if I could just specify, so I was answering the question from a very academic perspective on home energy upgrades assessed for health. You're totally correct. There's a lot of research on housing and health that has been conducted. But in terms of, and I'm really happy to be, if we've missed anything, but home energy upgrades and retrofits in communities assessed for their health impacts. I don't know if there are many. We did like in a study we did in Nunavik and Nunavut several years ago, when we look at the impact of social housing constructions on health and well-being, we saw a positive improvement on thermal comfort for people who got to move to a new dwelling. Whether or not that was associated with health outcome, we didn't assess in that study that we conducted in like 2014 to 2018. But there's a lot of research and a lot of data out there that could be, compiled and shared between, organizations, local organizations to answer this question.
Yeah, and I apologize, I sounded a little bit like a recovering academic there, and I do think this is an area where there should be more academic research. Yeah, absolutely.
We're entering into a conversation here, or just any documentation. It doesn't have to be academic, just documentation. So good,
Yeah.
Good story. Like there's so many initiatives and community-led housing innovation across the country happening in Indigenous communities that, it doesn't have to be academic. There's enough research conducted already.
Thank you both. There's also, I think, hopefully we'll be able to share a story of success from one of our Project Accelerator communities later on this year. We're doing some air quality monitoring pre and post retrofit and hoping to be able to tell a good story out of it in the end and hopefully quantify and like the outcomes, I guess, and tie some financial benefits to it as well. So another audience Q&A, if you can make one recommendation to policymakers regarding demand side management in Indigenous housing, what would it be? And how could DSM programs be better designed to reflect the realities of Indigenous communities? And I believe Dean will get that in the chat.
So I can start. There are really great good news stories of demand side management programs. Like I said, we're seeing some federally. More recently, some utilities have taken the lead over the years, and they've led to some really positive outcomes. Again, I was struck by the level of coordination in the U.S. programs, and that's coming to an end now as we speak under new U.S. legislation. But in terms of bringing demand side management levers together in their Department of Energy so that homeowners, housing managers could really leverage the benefits of that through one comprehensive program. And maybe that means, in designing something that is going to reflect the realities of Indigenous communities, we think of how can we tailor make a program where there will be that kind of uptake. And just thinking outside the box. Can there be something that will have that large of an impact, but that can also be tailored based on what's happening on the ground, tailored based on what are the realities of local leadership, and really linking these to climate outcomes, linking them to other things that we can quantify to help justify further investment in demand side management. One of the things we talk about in Indigenous clean energy is that demand side management is usually a much more cost-effective way to deal with electricity demand than building new generation, in addition to all of the positive health outcomes that we're talking about. So from a policy perspective, we need to think about ways to elevate it to be more than something sitting on the side of the table of an energy policy. It should be much more front and center at all levels of government. So I would say a more robust demand side management program is needed and appropriate given the kind of electricity demand we're facing.
Dr. Mylan, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. This is, yes, outside of my
Just
purview.
fine. So we'll move to our final question and then we'll wrap up. So that question is, if tomorrow you were handed all the resources and all the power, what's the first thing you would change about current housing policy? And that'll be in the chat in just a second. There, Carlin has it in the chat.
I will say it's not as common in Canada, but in other parts of the world, Indigenous communities sometimes view housing as something that could be administered by an independent authority or another agency, similar to the way we often treat economic development or development corporations, as finding ways structurally to make sure that planning, policy, and implementation take place over a longer term and are somewhat insulated by the kind of changes we see in policy when it comes to energy. So it's kind of an off-the-cuff answer to, I think, a question that could be answered in a number of ways. But maybe that's one potential solution is do we think about models, and we're going to put this out there. Can we think about housing models that are robust, that are reacting to demand and community needs in a slightly different way while preserving the kind of local jurisdiction, autonomy, and sovereignty of Indigenous communities? And I think there are models globally that are not as common here, and we might look to them and think there are different ways we could be addressing these challenges while still preserving local autonomy, and just taking those into consideration.
And to that, to which I fully agree, I would add just stop using the housing continuum altogether. The housing continuum supposes that people graduate across different types of housing, going from homelessness to the ultimate goal of private home ownership, right? But for many communities and in the current housing situation across the nation, home ownership is unattainable. And some people, it's not, the ultimate goal, right? To recognize that there are different ways of dwelling, that more transitional housing, more supportive housing are needed, that people can transition from being a homeowner to being without shelter quite rapidly because of unfortunate life events, right? So recognizing that housing is not a continuum, it's a wheel, it's a circle. We can navigate from one part to the other very quickly in some instances, but also considering housing within an ecosystem. So that would be the policy recommendations that I would make.
Great. Thank you both so much. That includes the questions for our panel. I think Dean just mentioned in the chat we did record this and it will be made available on the Canadian Climate Institute website. Finally, I'd just like to thank both of our panelists for sharing their insights, all of you for attending, and the team at Canadian Climate Institute who put so much work into every phase of this project. It was great to hear from both of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.